Welcome to the Student Conference 101, Creating a Successful Bid. I am Linda Zeck. I'm the Online Communication Specialist at ANS. All listeners have been muted. If you should have a question, you may either type it into the Q&A section at any time or wait for the Q&A portion of this presentation. I will unmute all the callers for the question and answer period at the end. During that time, we just ask that you be respectful and not talk over each other. Now I'd like to introduce the panelists for today: Catherine Perego, Matthew Jessica, Kaylin Kiesling, and Timothy Crook.
Hi everyone, this is Catherine Perego, and we are excited to be able to share our experiences with hosting student conferences, from deciding to write the bid through the bid writing process to being awarded a winning bid and the chance to host a student conference through the actual hosting of that conference. So we have a group of post-conference hosts that will talk us through what it takes to write a bid, what the judges are looking for, what it takes to host a conference, and some lessons learned that we hope will help you identify key aspects that you should keep in mind as your student sections consider hosting the National Student Conference. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Jessica from University of Wisconsin, who will talk about what you need to think about as you consider writing a bid.
All right, thanks, Catherine. Hello, everyone. Matt Jessica. I co-hosted the conference back in 2016 at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. As you're all thinking about what you want to do when you host a conference, one of the first things that all of us would probably recommend is to look for some of these resources. So if you go to the SSC's website, and we have the URL up here for you, there's a bunch of fantastic resources that you should look over. Highly encourage for anyone who's even considering looking at a conference and thinking about what goes into it. And some of the ones we'll point out are the Student Conference Proposal Manual. This one will specifically walk you through all the different things that you want to write into your proposal. The second one on there, the Planning Manual, is really written more for once you've been awarded the bid and you're actually in the planning process. That said, it's still a very good thing to look at before you start writing, just so you have an idea of what you're getting in for and what you're actually going to be doing once you plan the conference. Judge's Evaluation Worksheet, I'll sort of leave that for a little later for Kaylin to talk about. And then, but some of the best resources that you have available are looking at some of the previous proposals that have been successful. All of them are, I think, back to 2008 or so, are on the website, and there you'll find a bunch of interesting and useful statistics and figures from past conferences, as well as get an idea of some of the other interesting ideas that some of the previous chairs have come up with. And then another resource is any of us past chairs as well. We are very happy to help you if you reach out to us. If you need any of our emails, you can either just reach out to us maybe after the conference or email the SSC chair, currently Lane Karasik. And one of the reasons we actually encourage you to actually reach out and talk to us is because some of the information that you'll find in these different written resources don't quite tell the whole story, especially the proposals. They're written before we went into the actual planning process, so we didn't get to put in there everything that we learned going through the process itself. So we might have a few extra tips for you that you might find useful. And I do apologize for the next few slides. There is a lot of information up there. I've done my best to try to condense this part. And again, if you have any questions about any of these parts I'm going to touch upon, feel free to consult them more in the manuals or, again, ask one of us. Now that you've thought about writing a conference or thought about wanting to host a conference and made the decision to do so, you need to think about what you want to really achieve with the conference. And it's not just about bringing people in to have technical discussions about sharing their work, networking at a career fair, or going to see a bunch of really cool facilities. You need to think about how your team is going to be successful. And really the key to that is having the right people working on that with you. Especially the people in leadership, these need to be people who are really passionate about it, really enthusiastic about a conference, because, or being completely honest, it's a lot of work. It can be a lot of pain, but it's a lot of fun also, especially as things start to come together. But you need people who are going to be sort of in this sort of process for the long haul. These days, currently, the shortest one of these cycles would go is maybe writing your proposal a year and a half before, or writing your proposal for maybe over the course of a year. If you're successful, then you've got another year and a half of planning to do before you actually reach the conference part. So we're looking at really a minimum of 2.5 years of people being involved with this sort of process. And sometimes longer if your first bid isn't successful. Now, that's not to say that everyone on your team needs to be in it for a full 2.5 years. It's totally acceptable for people to come in, or to come in for certain parts, for the writing parts, for them to come in for the planning part, but people at the top in your leadership team need to be ready to do this for the long haul. On the same token for that, as you're thinking about who you want involved with this process, really what we want to see is we want to see a very wide range of students who are interested in this from your group. That goes all the way from people who have just joined your society and just want to get involved, freshmen and sophomores, all the way up to seasoned grad students who have been to a few conferences themselves, who know what goes into this, know how to look at things such as a technical program, for example. That's one part of what your leadership team needs to think about. Another key to hosting a successful conference is getting host institutional support. That means not only just talking to your host department, trying to get them on board, but also trying to get support from the college level, or even the university level, depending on the structure of your host institution. And this can range from any amount of them just being verbally supportive and encouraging of you, or willing, some harder support, such as financial support from the different levels of the university, to also staff support in a sense, or for letting professors have time to participate in this, letting their students take time from classes to participate in this. So it's important to begin conversations very early with your department, your department chair, some of the different professors, get an idea of how they could be of assistance to you. And the other part of the institutional support is going to be your student section. Again, you're going to need your leadership team and your committee to sort of write and run the conference, but at the same time, you're going to need students who are interested in participating in this, whether as volunteers or possibly also giving presentations at the event, to make sure that you have a large number of people who will help you make this thing successful. I think if you talk to some of the past chairs recently, we're talking about numbers of 50 or more volunteers over the course of a conference, something to think about. Then the other key that goes into this is having a good vision of what's going to make your conference unique and special, and we'll sort of get to that a little bit later. But one of the earliest things that you look at in some of these resources is, what's your conference theme? There's been some very interesting, some very fantastic themes in some of the past years. One of the ones, actually one of my personal favorites, I don't know if anyone else cares to jump in, but I thought the 2018 bid, if you look at that, did a really good job of incorporating the theme of nuclear quality into their bid. It wasn't just something that they put on as sort of a graphical idea or just something in their headers, but really something that, a central idea that works its way into all the different conference events they host, the different speakers that they bring in, the different workshops they have, or different facilities that they visit. Catherine, next slide, please. Getting into some more gritty details of what goes into hosting a conference, a few of the main overarching questions you need to consider are the usual: who, what, where, when. So I just want to touch on each of those briefly. One of the first ones that you're probably going to want to address is, where can you host this thing? In the conference, you're going to need a couple of different venues. You're going to need to think about where the actual conference itself is going to take place. You want to think about where the conference attendees are going to stay, and you're going to want to think about different venues for either eating or different places that you're going to be able to visit for this. And again, these conversations you want to start having as early as possible. One recommendation is to talk to some of your campus resources about some of their meeting spaces that they have, but in many cases, those might not be large enough, so you actually might want to engage some of the local venues as well. I highly recommend talking to Chamber of Commerce representatives in your cities or your areas. They'll have a great idea of who to reach out to start putting things such as different hotel proposals together, different venue proposals together. Then once you start to know where these different options are, where you really want to have this thing, then you can start thinking about the when of the conference. partially because a big part of when you have the conference is when these different facilities are available. Some of those of you who've been sort of following the student conferences for the last couple of years might know that we recently extended the process from turning your bid in 12 months before the conference to 18 months. The main motivator for this decision was so that the participating groups have a better chance of actually getting into their first choice of venues. A lot of these will actually start opening up bookings 12 to 18 months in advance. So we really wanted all of you who are submitting bids to be able to be successful in getting where you really wanted to be. Other timing concerns you want to think about are any sort of local festivals that you have going on. For example, in Madison, there was a very large dairy expo that happens every year that pretty much took over the hotels that we would be thinking about, so that was something we had to plan around. Other things are, is your school having any sort of major events that could interfere with or bring higher than normal traffic to your university? That might make it difficult for you to either get transportation or make it just difficult for your attendees to make it between the different locations. Then you have the what of your conference, what sort of makes your university special? What do you want to highlight? What do you want to showcase at your university? And then finally, the who. Now, the who is sort of a little obvious. You have your the different student sections that you want to bring in. You've got your career fair vendors, your labs that you want to bring in to the conference, but you need to think about how many people you're going to bring, where you're going to fit all these people. These different venues that you've thought about, are they going to be able to support them? Then finally, when you're about these major questions is, we're going to harp on this probably a bunch, is you always want to have a contingency plan. What happens if plan A fails? If you don't get your first venue, you get your venue, but you don't get your first dates. What happens if you get higher than normal attendance or lower than normal attendance, things like that nature. Next. A few details about the program. So I mentioned this before. As you start to craft your program, a lot of these are going to be the same, especially for those of you who have been to conferences before. Certain things aren't going to change. You're always going to have students giving technical talks. You're probably always going to have a poster session. You're always going to want to have a career fair. But everything around this, or you think about what makes your university special, what makes your department special, what sort of unique instruments or labs do you have, what makes your local area special? Do you have a local plant that you have? Do you have a local military base? I think Florida visited the naval base and one of the nuclear subs there. So what sort of things can you show off that are going to make people interested in attending? In addition to all the technical events, you're also going to think about non-technical events. This is really where some of your theme planning comes in. What sort of non-technical skills do you want to showcase at your thing? Do you have campus resources that are, for example, really good at bringing in grad students, for example, or public speaking, or a really good faculty program, different career options that you can think about? Sort of ties in the same thing to guest speakers. As far as guest speakers go, when you're writing a proposal, what we want to see is that you put some thought into this. That you've gone creative and outside the box. You don't have to bring in everyone that you wrote down in your proposal. That's not to say that you shouldn't try, but in that case, I mean, you should really blue sky some of these ideas. Really think outside the box of who can I bring to our conference. So you might have some university or alumni connections who are at the different utilities or vendors or different labs. You might have some students in your section who have interned at different places and might know someone who's really good to bring in. Think about all those different connections. Really, as these details start to fill out, then you start sort of narrowing down on a bunch of these things. When am I going to have this event? When am I going to, or what room in my facility's first choice could I have this in? When you're writing the proposal, we want to say as much detail as reasonably possible. Everything does not need to be perfectly planned out, but we do want to see that you've really put attention to detail, that you've thought about all these little things, because what's going to make your conference successful is each of these little things falling into place. And so we want to just make sure that you're able to think about those things. Next. And then the other side of the conferences also is the financial side. How are you going to support your conference and pay for everything? course, the big thing that we're going to be looking at in this portion is your budget. Similar to your technical planning of the conference, we want to see that you put as much thought into it as possible. We want you to have covered as many different aspects of the conference, but we also want it to be realistic. For example, it's nice to say that, oh, we're going to bring in $250,000 for a conference, and it's going to be great. We're going to be able to pay for all these wonderful dinners and speakers and events. Well, that may or may not be realistic depending on what's available for you. So rather than saying that we think we can raise the most money a conference has ever had, probably isn't going to be as good to put as this is, or saying this is how much we think our conference is going to cost, and actually be realistic about it, even if it's not as high as certain other conferences have been, especially because some of you are or people writing it are in very different areas of the country, very different cost of living. So what works for one budget might not be the same for another one. For example, like comparing somewhere like really big and expensive, such as MIT in Boston, to somewhere that might be a little more remote, such as Texas A&M. Going into a little bit of details about the different parts of the budget, of course, you have your revenue and your expenses. Revenue is where you're really going to think about fundraising and registration. We encourage you to look at some of the past bids, see what they've done for different fundraising schemes. Also highly encourage you to talk to past chairs, because usually what happens in their fundraising schemes can be a little different from what they put in their proposal, just because of the various financial climates changing from year to year, and possibly different company policies or government policies, for example. A couple of years ago, there was a policy that no DOE labs were able to sponsor a conference in name. So we had to come up with creative ways to sort of get around that and work with the labs to how to be able to make that successful. That sort of falls more into the planning process, so I don't want to harp on that too much, but moral of that is just to talk to your resources. Expenses, again, those are pretty much self-explanatory, but the thing I do want to highlight is don't forget, there's a lot of things that people can forget, such as gratuity and also possibly tax. We'll get to tax in a little bit, but sometimes it can be applicable. Don't forget to include that. Travel assistance, those of you who have been to conferences sort of have an idea of how this works, that the student section, the hosting section, if at all possible, will do what they can to reimburse some of the expenses to the university. Now, as you're going through the proposal writing process, what you want to keep in mind is you want to try to do 100% of a travel assistance if at all possible. But the reality may be that depending on where you are, how expensive it is to get to your location, that might not be completely realistic. So again, we want you to plan for to do as much as you can for the students, but also be realistic as well. And then, as I said, with the technical program and the basic logistics planning, contingency plans, what happens if you don't raise as much money as you think about? What are you going to cut first? What are you going to cut second? What can you absolutely not cut that'll make your conference still successful? The overarching goal of the financial portion should be to minimize net cost to students. Professionals are also going to be attending the conference. That's great, but your first priority is always going to be making this conference as accessible to students. So as you go through the proposal manual, for example, there are also a couple of chapters I didn't quite touch on, but that do sort of fall into this area I call the tricky subjects. One of these is transportation, which can cover everything from how you get from your local airport to the conference venue, how are people going to be driving in if they're from a little bit closer, and also how are you going to get your guests between the various conference events. This is a very difficult one to do. My personal opinion is I haven't really seen a transportation section that's really gone into as much detail as it probably should have during the proposal writing process. The one that I helped write included, but one of the things that people really do remember about a conference is how well were they able to get from point A to point B, especially how well were they able to get from the technical part of the conference to the dinner, to the food. Don't want to get between people and their food. And so if your transportation is going well, no one's going to really think much about it. That's wonderful. But if you have transportation issues, people will remember it. So when you're writing your transportation section, don't just think about, oh, well, we need a shuttle from here to here. Really think about what shuttle companies are available, what is going to give us the best rate? How many buses can we get? Is this consistent with the number of attendees that we're thinking about? Again, that sort of attention of detail is important to showcase in your proposal. Banking financial oversight is another sort of tricky one. There's been a lot of different approaches over the last couple of years. Recently, what's been going on is, what's happened is there's an effort to try to do as much of the actual banking through the ANS as much as possible. ANS is a great infrastructure in place for that. They've already got things set up for dealing with large accounts, such as from your $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 sponsors. So we highly encourage you to work with ANS to develop a banking strategy. Now, the trade-off of that is you don't always have as much ready access to funds. So you also want to think about, if I need to have some petty cash on hand, $1,000, couple $1,000 for quick expenses, how are we going to be able to handle that? How are we going to work with our primary accounts? Where are we going to store that money? How are we going to keep track of that money and be accountable with it to ANS? It is acceptable to have a secondary account locally that you use for most of these transactions that you periodically request money from the larger ANS account. Things such as this, you can talk to previous chairs, wonderful resource, but sometimes an even better resource is to talk to ANS staff about your thoughts. You can reach out to them and say, look, this is what we'd like to do about this. How can we make this work with you? Since ANS staff is going to be very important to the conference, they have a lot of power. They can, if things go well, or if things are going well, then they will be, or they have a lot of power to help things go well and smoothly, I'll say that. Something that also falls in this category is tax exemption. This is just one of those things you need to talk to your university resources, talk to ANS staff about tax exemption. If I have the conference in California, is ANS tax exempt in California? If I have my own secondary account, what steps do I need to take to make that secondary account tax exempt? Do not ever assume you have tax exemption, otherwise, or because that will not be the case. Then the final tricky subject is liability section. All the conference proposals will have them. This is a section that can sometimes be overlooked, but again, we really want to see detail in there. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in a conference. You don't want it to, but you want to think about what might happen that could have negative impacts on the conference organizers themselves, impacts on your department that's hosting, and negative impacts on ANS as a professional society. What sort of physical hazards might there be? What sort of financial liabilities might there be? Big one is what sort of food and beverage policies and potential liabilities are there. So again, look at past proposals, talk to other different resources. You want to hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And I think that covers everything I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. We're going to turn it over to Kaylin now, who's going to talk about the portion of the bid after you have submitted, what it looks like when the judges get their hands on it, and the selection process. And keeping all of these things in mind will really help as you are creating the bid to make sure that you've got everything that you can in the bid to give yourselves and your student section as good a chance as possible of getting selected to host the conference. Kaylin?
Hi, yeah, I'm Kaylin Kiesling. I was a co-chair for the 2016 conference at Wisconsin with Matt, who we just heard from. So like Catherine said, I'll be talking about kind of what the judges think about what this process is, and for things that you, as you write this and submit your final proposal, things to think about. So just first off, who are these judges? That might kind of be an unknown thing to you. So the judges are people like us, these panelists, people who have hosted conferences in the past, people who have attended many, many conferences and been highly involved. So they might not have been the chairs, but they've been really involved in the planning process. The SSC chair, the Student Sections Committee chair, right now is Lane Karasik. Often is a judge and will organize these judges. So they're all people who have experience and have seen a lot of stuff happen. Like, for example, I've been attending conferences since 2013, so I've seen a lot of stuff. So when we read these, we do think about past experiences and how, we might have an idea of what works and what doesn't. So just so you guys are aware of that. What is the judging process like? So basically, you guys submit your proposals, and the judges who were selected by our conference or by our SSC chair will each individually review all of the proposals independently, and we use a judging sheet. It's called the evaluation worksheet, and it is actually available online for everyone to see. It's quite an extensive worksheet. There are things that are pass or fail, things that are rated on a scale of the judges choosing, but, subjective. And then there's things, just other categories like, did we like certain aspects of it? This evaluation worksheet is available on the website, which Matt showed you and we'll talk about in a minute. But we will go through that, fill out those sheets for every single proposal. I know I take very detailed notes on every single thing, and I compare those notes across all the proposals. And I will go back and look through. So it's a pretty detailed process. We're not just reading these and kind of going, oh, that one sounded like the best. We do care a lot about all these details. And then we'll get together and discuss and hopefully come up with, some conclusion about who should be hosting. So that kind of gets into, when we're reading these, what do the judges care about? The judges care about basically what's on this worksheet, this evaluation worksheet, and what's in the manuals. So as we're going through these evaluation worksheets, there's a lot of things that are pass or fail. I care about this, that every single proposal has all the things that are pass-fail. Or no-go, I think they might be called. Because that list is there for everyone, I expect that when a proposal comes in that you've at least addressed every single one of those. For proposals that might be reduced from previous years, which is very common. I mean, our proposal had this. We submitted 2 years in a row. When I read those, judges will sometimes share, what's changed from previous years for those who might not have judged in the past year. But if I've seen 2 proposals back to back, I do care about, seeing the things that we addressed or things that we commented on in the past that needed fixing. We care that all of those things are fixed and that people are listening. And that's mostly because we want a conference to be successful. When a judge gives a critique or when we have these list of notes that we might give a proposal, that is really because we want this conference to be successful and so that it is easiest on you as hosts when you're planning it. We'll also care about details, so the consistency between different sections. So if you said in a section maybe about the technical program that your AV cost is X or something like that per room. And then we look at the budget, and if there's a different cost in there, well, that's a problem. There's a detail inconsistency, and most judges will cross-reference all these things to make sure they're consistent so that to make sure, information is actually what it is. So if you have 2 different numbers there, we're not quite sure what's the right number. Is your budget correct? Are you properly planning for that? Sometimes it has to do with the room capacities. That's a common one. So we care about all those details. If you say something in one place, do you say the same thing in another place, or are you saying something completely different? We also care about things that are novel. Matt mentioned this a lot. There are some things that probably aren't going to change. You're probably going to have a career fair. Students will be presenting technical papers and posters, stuff like that. But we also like to see things that are novel that you have just thought of, and that's great. But if you do that, we want to make sure that you've thought through it. You've thought about what could go wrong and you've addressed it. You've justified, if it's something substantially different, you've justified why you're going to do it to us. and that the logistics of it are worked out. Things we don't care about. We don't care about fluff, to be honest. We like reading stuff, but keep in mind that these documents have gotten upwards to 80 to 100 pages, and we might have anywhere from 2 to 6 to read at a time. We don't care about fluff, and what I mean by fluff is I don't care what your menu options are going to be for a dinner meal. That's great, you're serving dinner. I don't need to know what those options are. Stuff like that. What we care about mostly is the logistics. Have you thought about how you're actually planning this out? So keep that in mind. We want you to get to the point. This might seem a little superficial, but we do care about typos. That is an indicator to us that that you guys paid attention to detail. It can be very helpful for the whole team to be working on a collaborative document because it's really easy to miss typos if one person's reading the same thing over and over again, of course. So if you have everyone working on it, that both gives you it sets up a working environment where everyone can check each other's work, which will be very helpful down the line. But also when you have a lot of these typos, it kind of shows us or tells us, man, you know, you've missed things here and there, and there's a lot of them. Like, are you going to miss details and forget about things, or maybe not check your work? Or double check things when you're planning, and those can grow into very large errors when you actually have the conference. So we just want to make sure that that's not happening. Let me just double check my own notes here that I've got everything. Yeah, so if we go to the next slide, Catherine, I don't know if we're there or not. Matt mentioned this, and I just mentioned this as well. On our website, the SSC website, there are references for you guys, or resources for you guys. The proposal manual, I highly, highly suggest that you read through that before you write, just as Matt suggested. And also this planning manual can be very helpful. That will kind of cause you, if you read through the planning manual as you're writing your proposal, it might bring things up that you didn't know you had to think about. So it can be a very helpful resource as you're planning. The judge's evaluation worksheet. This one is crucial. I highly suggest that as you are writing your proposal, if you get like your first copy done, you go through this judge's evaluation worksheet and check everything off. If you're missing things, go back and add them. And keep doing that until you've gotten everything on that sheet. And of course, past proposals are a great resource. As Matt said, they might not have everything in them though, because no proposal is perfect, and that's fine. We're picking the best proposal. So there might be things that have changed from year to year, but they can also still be a great resource. However, when the judges read proposals, we can tell when things have been copied from past proposals. So use them as a resource, but don't copy from them, please. We can tell that.
Great. Thanks so much, Kaylin. All right, we are going to turn it over to Timothy Crook now from Texas A&M, and he is going to talk about some lessons learned. As Kaylin and Matt both alluded to and discussed, the proposals, even the winning ones that are on the SSC website, they still don't tell the full picture. And for those of us that have actually hosted a student conference, we have we have a lot of lessons learned that we've gathered throughout the whole process. So Timothy's going to run through some of the more common ones that we kind of see year to year. And these are good things to include in your bid to show the judges that you're really thinking ahead and trying to contingency plan. Again, like we come back to, we really want to see that you're contingency planning. All right, Tim, there you go.
Okay, so contingency is a great word to start off talking about lessons learned for sponsorship. The nuclear industry has really had a number of up and down years, and it's been especially tight on some of the utility side, which is where traditionally a large portion of money comes from for each of these schools. So we definitely experienced a bit of that crunch when we had the conference at Texas A&M in 2015, and it's very likely that unless we're just having a really great time in the industry, you will have to have a number of contingencies and not only have realistic budgets, but have clear things outlined that you can cut. And what a lot of schools have done, and I think what we did was kind of tier expenses into things that are essential, things that are, recommended, and then things that are, not fluff, but a lot of that stuff that would be nice to have. Another thing about sponsorship that's worth noting is involve your sponsors, if possible, in throughout the event, not only in terms of giving them items to sponsor, which you might have seen if you looked at past sponsorship packets, which should also be available on as the resources. If not, then you can definitely contact past chairs, and we'll make sure to get you those sponsorship packets so you kind of know how we organize, how different conferences have organized their sponsorship structure. But what I essentially mean by that is beyond giving them just name recognition and key places and larger booths at the career fair, you can also have sponsors come in as speakers. So when we had the Navy come in as the largest sponsor for our conference, we actually invited the Navy to send a speaker, and the Navy, those higher ups tend to have had a lot of experience talking to people, so they tend to be good speakers. And a lot of times companies will have kind of specific people that if they're interested in giving that much money to the conference, they're interested in sending somebody with a specific message. So definitely be open to that. But on the flip side of it, don't be afraid to plan out in your proposal, especially a couple of key speakers, two or three key speakers, because you can always fit the speakers around, and the likelihood is you won't be able to count on sponsorship giving you 3 speakers, 1 for each night. So go ahead and have people picked out, and this gives you a chance to make your conference unique in the proposal and in execution by those unique people that you bring in. On the technical program, the technical program is one of those essential things that happens every year, and there's certain things that don't get changed. And we mentioned like that there's those parts. What that means is that you need somebody who is reliable, who you can count on to be your technical chair, depending on kind of how it's structured, and that's part of the organization matrix. But depending on how it's structured, your technical program chair is either one of the co-chairs or is basically an equivalent to the co-chair. We chose to just make that its own kind of thing, and had Lane Karasik, who's now the SOC chair, do a great job. But another note about the technical program, beyond having that technical program chair who you can count on to make sure that it happens consistently the way that it's happened before, is finding a place to leave your mark. And so sometimes this is a specific technical track for innovation. That's certainly been done before, and for advocacy. So try to add an element of technical program that is unique to your conference, and make that technical part not as dry as it traditionally can be. For program and event planning, it's important to kind of remember that you're making an experience here. Though it's a conference, sure, and there's networking and other things that are going to be done, it's so short that you really kind of have to plan everybody's day out and kind of have everything already scheduled for somebody, and essentially have the entire block of time for those 8 hours kind of filled, and more with socials. But of course, remember, you gotta leave room for people to network and to go to the career fair. So just kind of build all of that into the event planning. Another thing that I think is really important on the event planning side to take advantage of is the resources that your school provides. A lot of times, your schools will have either in-house catering, or they'll have kind of established deals, people they recommend. And we actually got a really great caterer through the school, through instructions from the school, and locked that relationship down and had guarantees on prices before our bid was submitted. And that's something that you can really take advantage of with school resources. And just in general, the catering and all those relationships for supply, try to get that sorted out before your conference proposal. Don't just have estimates. Have what those, know who you'd be working with if you continue to win the bid and go down that road and get those estimates for your budget, of course. On the organizational matrix, so this kind of means just the way your team's organized. It really is important to have a well-organized team. You'll especially once you win the proposal, have a lot more people come in who are interested in helping. You might have some people who are just interested in writing it. We definitely have that, especially when you have people who are seniors who are looking at grad school in a number of places, and they may not be around for grad school, but they do, like their alma mater and want to contribute. We had somebody who basically wrote the first draft of our proposal, and then the year that we did not win it, and then we submitted it again. But that person was definitely willing to help contribute to writing, even though she wasn't around to run the conference. That being said, you're going to have a lot of people who want to come in once you win it, and you really need to have a good structure with clearly laid out duties, know where each person is supposed to be contributing, and then hold them accountable. Because one of the worst things that we saw was we would have somebody who had a lot of energy and seemed like they really wanted it, and then you assign them something, and if you don't check in on them, sometimes nothing gets done, and you eventually just kind of will lose people, and you have to be unafraid to kind of maintain order in that team. And if somebody is not doing their duties, you hold them accountable and be willing to remove them. And thankfully we didn't have any too serious situations like that, but we did have somebody on our team, for example, who kind of was like very interested initially and was like, yeah, I don't really want to do this. Sorry, I've been slacking for the last 3 weeks. I'm quitting. And that's just kind of one of those things that you'd like to avoid by holding somebody accountable. And thankfully, it was just a few weeks that we lost of that person's work. Another part of that is make sure that everybody's contributing. Because the process is kind of staged, there's certain things that may have a lot of work 1 week. So even though somebody has clear duties and you're like, well, the technical program chair or the hospitality chair may not be responsible for any overlapping duties, but if there's nothing that week, if you have a weekly meeting, there's nothing to do. Try to find some way for your whole team to have involvement so that people don't feel like they're being left out or neglected. And always remember to praise your team for the great job they're doing, because again, everyone's a volunteer. So remember that. And part of that is feeding your volunteers if possible. I think this is just something that's kind of understated, but especially like the days before your conference when you're doing all the setup, when you have volunteers come in, like the easiest way to pay them is in food, which is I think a common exploit at colleges, but it's something to definitely do because it makes everybody feel more appreciated and gives them energy to keep working if you have to have a long night of prep, which has certainly happened. On the attendance and registration, on the registration side of things first, whatever is registered may not actually be indicative of your numbers. You tend to get a lot of late registrations and on-site registrations. I think the ratio and the numbers are there, and Matt, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but the ratio is usually about 75% of students who are going to show up are registered ahead of time, and you get a good portion of on-site. I'm free what the ratios are for the professionals, but what's something important to keep in mind is that higher student attendance doesn't actually mean more money for your conference, more revenue that you'll be bringing in, or more money that you'll have to spend. It actually costs you more money because you're kind of taking a hit on each student to make it more attractive for students to come and experience this conference and the benefits it provides. And as a part of that, you're utilizing the professional registrations to offset the attendance. So that's a huge thing to remember. The importance of the professional attendance not only comes from the job potential and the relationship building that those students can make when they're meeting professionals in their field, but it also comes from their much higher cost of registration, and you definitely need those professional attendees, and don't let that slack. It's not just a student conference, even though it is geared towards students. You want about a 2-to-1 ratio if possible, or at least a 3-to-1 ratio of students to professionals. So students are interacting and actually feeling like it's doing something for their career. On miscellaneous things, Matt mentioned transit, and that's something that can't be reiterated enough. People will remember poor transit experiences, and transit almost never plays out the way, even the way you may have it contracted out before your conference. You have to have contingencies on transit. Make sure you have backup buses to make sure you have some flexibility. I know that we ended up adding more buses in our rotation because we had people getting kind of stuck waiting for buses for like 30 minutes at a time the first night to transfer locations. And so we made sure that there were additional buses that next night. That's something that you have to kind of be prepared to adjust to if you have higher attendance or, there's traffic, depending on how far you're moving. Contingencies for transit, because that is an easy place for things to go wrong, and they do affect everyone's experience. And since you're making this whole thing, and again, you're planning out this whole day, it can really affect the timing of everything. Something important to keep in mind is the tax exempt status for you as a student organization, for ANS, and how it varies from state to state. Some states do not accept tax exempt statuses from other states. So, for example, our caterer, had we used ANS as our bank, our total bill for our food was around $50,000, and we were not required to pay tax on that if we paid it from a Texas A&M University student account. But if we used a nonprofit outside of the state of Texas, we were still required to pay taxes because of some Texas state laws. So that's something to keep in mind. Tax can add up as an expense. And of course, don't forget tax and gratuity when you're expecting and planning those expenses. I think that was mentioned earlier. And then another thing, make sure you leave time, again, when you're planning this whole thing out, leave time for the career fair, because that is kind of the, even though there's a lot of this other stuff that's going on, like if someone is a senior or a junior and you really want positive experiences from this conference, the two parties you have to please are your school and your department that you're putting it on for, because you're recruiting students for them. And the other side is the professionals who come there to recruit. They want to hire these people, so they need to have as much time as they need to interact. And so that means making sure students have time to go walk through the career fair and interact for those internships and jobs, and just do that networking, because that is some of the most important part of these conferences. So if anybody else has anything else to add on lessons learned, feel free to jump in, but that is what I had on my notes.
That covers everything that we had planned today for the presentation part. So I'm not sure if anyone on the call as an attendee has any questions, but for those that are listening to this recording, the link to the SSC website also has the SSC Chair's email address. It's like sscchair@gmail.com. And that's a resource that we really all encourage you to use. We used it as we were all writing our respective bids to host the conference, and the SSC Chair, is very familiar with past conference chairs, and really is more than happy to help guide you in the right direction for people that can answer your questions if they're not the right contact. So that's definitely another resource that we encourage you to use.
I think from all of us that everyone would echo is that we do this webinar and give you this advice, and if you submitted a proposal in the past, or if you do submit one and you don't get it and you get a bunch of note sheets back or a bunch of notes and critiques on it, I want you to know that it's really because we want to help you guys, and us as past chairs, as people have mentioned, are great resources, and we really, really want to help everyone. We may have made mistakes when we planned the conference. We don't want you to make those same mistakes. So when we talk about all this stuff, it's really because we want you to do really well, and we care that your school does well. So just keep that in mind and know that we're not ever trying to be mean when we say things. We just want to help you guys. So that's all I have to say.
Yeah, and I'm going to tie into what Kaylin was just saying about reaching out to us. Is usually one of the best correlators of what bid is going to be successful is who has reached out to us, who has reached out to the SSC chair, who's reached out to ANS staff to, get the answers to these sort of questions. And on a related note to that, we've mentioned that there is some information that's just not out there because it wasn't written into the bids, but there is also a reason that we don't publicize all of the financial information or the attendance information, for example, after a conference. Is we do want to see who's willing to put in that effort to find that information, who's willing to ask those questions, because when you're in the planning stages of a conference, there's going to be a lot that you don't know. You need to not be afraid to ask those questions to us or to staff or to whomever you need to get the answers from.
Okay, and this concludes our webinar. Thank you so much to everybody who participated and those that were on the call to listen. Have a great day.